Okay, we're, Shawnee Vickery sent me something this week, and I've been paying attention to some of the news, and I am astounded at the boldness of the dark side. I mean, there is, when you think about the aggressive rioting, the destruction, and frankly, the lack of resistance on the part of good people and people that we put in place. We pay taxes for the police force. We pay taxes to support our government officials that are supposed to keep the peace and understand what order is and what peace is and what is criminal behavior. And the dark side is really bold. The dark side is kind of like a 2-year-old that's always pushing the edge of the envelope. They're always wanting to see, how far will you let me go? And it's up to people like you and me to stand up and speak up. And it's tough. It's a messy business. It's a dirty business. Christians, I can speak for myself. What do I like? I like friends. I like being at peace. I like having wonderful conversations. I don't like confronting evil people. But in this world, we need to do that some. We need to be bold. What did the prophecies say? Walk with great confidence was in the first prophecy. Be bold was in Greg Paulus's prophecy. And we really need to be willing to do that. And I want to go into Samuel today. And I want to get lessons from Samuel. And when you read the Bible, I don't know if you have a journal or what you do when you read the Bible to help pull out its meaning. But what God does is, I think if God made a reader's version of the Bible, it would probably have a couple paragraphs and then a little summary about, the lesson is, but that's not what the Bible does. The Bible leaves it up to the reader to mine the depth of what's going on in the scripture and figure out what's going on in the scripture and what is being taught to us. And so I want to go to 1 Samuel chapter 13. I want to look into the life of Saul and Jonathan. And here we have a very interesting situation, a situation that actually often presents itself on planet Earth, where you have a boss or a leader or someone in authority who's an ungodly person, who's not walking with God, who's making bad decisions, who's producing bad fruit. And then you have somebody under their authority who is walking with God, making good decisions. And it makes it very tough on that godly person. And there needs to be a lot of prayer and a lot of wisdom. And frankly, often a lot of risk and a lot of boldness and guts to know when do you follow a leader, even when you know what they're doing is not right? And when do you just say, enough, I'm not doing this, you're wrong? And when do you call them on it? When do you confront them on it? Or when do you just have to bail and go to a different system? And this is very difficult, very, very challenging stuff. We certainly see this with the apostles in Acts chapter 5. The religious leaders who were the authorities in the land said, don't teach or speak in the name of Jesus Christ. And the apostles were, I'm sorry, we're not going to do that. It cost them. They got publicly whipped. That's not fun in any stretch of the imagination, but they understood that was the price that they paid. And there is a price, because the devil is the god of this world. There's always been a price for soldiers. It doesn't matter what battle, what army, where do you want to go? As far back in history as you want to go, soldiers, good men and good women are collateral damage. The good people die when they shouldn't. And there's collateral damage in the army of God. When you and I sign up, when we made Jesus Christ Lord, we made him our commanding officer. We joined the army of God. There's that song, Onward Christian Soldiers. And there's collateral damage in our lives sometimes. But the option is really in a couple different prophecies. This morning we heard about looking to the future. Why would God have to tell us that? because sometimes we can get caught up in this world, in this life, and in the trials of this life and how painful they are. And then we shrink back because we don't like that pain. I don't like that pain. I don't like that persecution. And we can shrink back and not be the bold kind of people that we are. And frankly, with the boldness in the dark side that I've been seeing in the last couple of weeks, we Christians just simply need to take a risk. We simply need to be able to speak out and call a spade and say, that's wrong, that's criminal. And on a spiritual level, that's ungodly. And for like one of the prophecies said, there are people wandering around out there who are hungry. They've got to hear the truth. If there was a physically hungry person outside my house walking up and down the street and I had food, but for some reason or other, I was like timid about saying so, that hungry person would never get fed. But if I shouted out of the front door of the house, hey, are you hungry? And the person said, yeah, I'm kind of hungry. Okay, I've got food. And that's our situation. There are hungry people out there. They're hungering for food. Somebody has got to stand up and say, I've got food. Similarly, there are evil people out there, and that was in one of the prophecies too, who won't hear the truth. Well, nothing we can do about them, but we still speak the truth. So in 1 Samuel chapter 13, here's Saul, and he hasn't reigned very long. And already, some people's worst enemy is success. That seems to be the case with King Saul. He apparently was a pretty solid individual when he was chosen to be king. But then his heart shifted. He became full of pride. He started to guard his position. He became jealous of leaders like David, who had no designs on his throne, but just simply because of who they were, the character they had, he became jealous. And eventually he became afflicted by a demon. He became demonized. We use the word possessed sometimes. And he became at least possessed with a spirit of murder. And then we'll see he made a series of other bad decisions. Eventually God tore the kingdom from him. Eventually he ended up dead, killed by the Philistines. So it's very interesting here as we read 1 Samuel 13 and 14, the interplay. There's a phenomenal interplay and lessons about boldness, walking by the Spirit, recognizing evil, seeing how the adversary works, all wrapped up in here. So we'll start in 1 Samuel chapter 13, and verse 16 says, Saul and Jonathan his son and the people who were present with them stayed in Geba of Benjamin. And Geba is just a little ways above Jerusalem, maybe 6-7 miles, something like that. But the Philistines encamped in Michmash, and Michmash was a couple miles, maybe a mile or so, maybe a mile or two north of Geba. So the two groups are pretty close. Now the Philistines have control at this time, but Saul is at some level attempting to put together a group, but it's unsure of exactly what his plans are because he didn't ever state he had any plans to attack or anything. Verse 17, the raiding parties came out of the camp of the Philistines in 3 companies. Now, the raiding companies could be successful because as Israel turned away from God and turned to idols, which during the Judges period they consistently did, that gave the adversary more and more time to get his foothold in Israel and to oppress the children of Israel. And during the period of the Judges, there was a whole series of oppressions. And so here come the Philistines. They got established on the coast of Israel. That turned out to be an advantage for them because then they had easy trade with more advanced civilizations like what was going on in Greece and that type of thing. And so they had access to weapons that the Israelites did not have. And we see by the time of Goliath, they had chainmail, they had all this other stuff. So the Philistines had an advanced weapon system. Later on in Israelite history, when Israel fights the Assyrians, the reason the Assyrians were able to march through the all over the Middle East like a knife through butter was that at that point the Assyrians had developed a more advanced weapon system than most of their, I will say even any of their, the enemy countries they attacked had. But the Philistines not only had very, very good weapons, but we'll read verse 19, there was no blacksmith found throughout the land of Israel. The Philistine, I'll talk about this when we get to the verse, but the Philistines had disarmed the Israelites. And because of that, they're bold, they're brassy, they're overconfident. And so here in verse 17, while the Philistine army could have seen Saul and his little group of 600 men and simply put their army together and gone and smashed Saul, smashed the resistance, and that would have been really, really genuinely dark times for Israel. In their overconfidence, their arrogance, and perhaps I'd like to think even maybe being misled by their pagan gods, the spiritual battle going on behind the physical battle, instead of taking their superior and better weaponed army and simply attacking this little group of 600 men that Saul had, killing the king, killing the army, and having a much stronger foothold over all Israel for gosh knows how many years. Instead, what they decided to do was send out raiding parties. And you guys know what that's going to amount to. Harassing people, raping women, killing people, carrying off children, carrying off livestock, a lot of stealing, burning of crops, that kind of thing. Just terror. And, one of the questions we need to ask ourselves is, since the Old Testament says so little directly about demons and the devil, how did Jesus Christ have so much knowledge of them in his ministry? And he answered that in John 8:44 when he looked at the Pharisees and he said to them, "You are of your father the devil, and the works of your father you will do." That if we study the people in the Old Testament who are pagan and who follow the devil, we'll see how the devil himself acts. And this is the way, if the devil's people think they're in a position of authority over you, that they have power over you, then they're going to harass you, they're going to bully you, they're going to make your life miserable. It's like, I'm not going to finish them off, I'm just going to make them miserable. That's one of the tactics of the enemy. That's one of the tactics of demonic people. That's why we have bullying in school. That's why we have bullying on the internet. We have bullying on the workplace. All comes out of the devil, and it's exactly the way the devil operates, and we see it here. These raiding parties, that's all they are. They're just bullies, except unfortunately, they're very deadly, very destructive bullies, but they're bullies nevertheless. So it says the raiding party came out of the camp of the Philistines in 3 companies. One company turned the way that leads to Ophrah, to the land of Shual. That raiding party went north. Verse 19, let's see. And then 18, another company turned toward the road to Beth Horon, and that's east. And another company turned toward the road of the border that looks down the valley of Zeboim toward the wilderness, and that would be to the southeast. So the raiding party left Michmash and went to the north, to the east, and to the southeast. And so they were, and then it describes why the Philistines would have been so confident. And it says, now there was no blacksmith to be found throughout all the land of Israel, for the Philistines said, lest the Hebrews make themselves swords or spears. So the adversary has always known the value of disarming the people. And it's one of the things that's very firmly set in God's word is the ability the right. It's really actually a right. The right that people have to defend themselves, their families, their societies, and their property. The adversary doesn't want you to be able to do that. The adversary wants you to live in fear. The adversary wants you to be a continual victim. The adversary wants you to be bullied through your whole life. The adversary wants to push you around, take what you have, destroy the work of your hands, demoralize you, and hopefully maybe get you to either react and commit murder, and then you get to be executed, or commit suicide because you're just tired of it all, or you just check out of the fight. So the adversary is constantly pestering and picking, and he tries to disarm people, and it astounds me. You talk about all these people that are like, the National Rifle Association, it's from the pit of hell or something like that. It's not. It's the organization that's allowing people. The NRA has done more to defend personal rights to bear firearms, which allows us to protect ourselves. And people that, you've got different kinds of people out there. Some of them are actually working for the devil. They know exactly what it means to disarm the people. The Nazis disarmed the German people before they took over. You study the history of national disarmament, and there's huge disarming. Well, gosh, they disarmed the people basically in Australia, and they say, well, murder's down. Yeah, murder may be down, but strong arm crime, rape, muggings are through the roof because people can't protect themselves. But of course, the news media isn't going to cover that. You're not going to hear that on CNN or the other major news medias. You and I have to know there's two kinds of people out there. One that fight your ability to protect yourself. One is people who actually work for the devil. They want to bully you. They want to take advantage of you, and they will push, like I say, like a 2-year-old, they keep pushing the borders to see how many rights they can take away. And then you've got people that just think it's they're just naive, and they think, well, gee, if we took away all the guns, then there wouldn't be any shootings, there wouldn't be any crime. That really, first of all, look at history. The gun is a fairly recent invention. If the gun was the problem, there'd be no murder, no crime until the gun was invented. Actually, there's horrible crime through history, terrible crime. And you see it here. This is 20, the time of Saul. This is basically almost 3,000 years ago, 2970, something like that. And what's the enemy doing? Trying to disarm the people. So you have evil people trying to disarm people. You have people that are just naive and think that if we disarm people, society will become better. It won't. Taking away my handgun is not, the devil's not, well, gosh, we better not mess with John. We just took away his handgun, so now we've got to be peaceful. You got to be kidding to think that way. That's not the way it works. This is 2,900 plus years ago, and the enemy is disarming the people. And what's the result of it? Raiding parties that rape and kill and steal and burn. And it's been going on for all that time, and it's not going to end now. You and I, again, we need to be as bold as the adversary. We need to be armed with information. We need to speak up. So anyway, they took away all the weapons and said, because otherwise the Hebrews will make swords or spears and actually be able to defend themselves. On the night of his arrest, when Jesus Christ was at the Last Supper with his disciples, he knew, at that point, he knew that things were going to get really tough after he was gone, after he was executed. So he said, if you don't own a sword, go and buy one. Check the Gospel of Luke. If you don't own a sword, go and buy one. Why? The sword was the apex weapon at that time, and Christ knew that things were going to get pretty dicey. So anyway, Christ understood the value of being able to protect yourself. So basically then is more humiliation and more harassment. Verse 20, so all the Israelites went down to the Philistines, each man to sharpen his plow blade, mattock, axe, and sickle. Verse 21, and the charge was 2/3 of a shekel for the plowshares, the mattocks, the forks, the axes, and to set the goads. And to set the goads is the point, the metal point on the tip of the ox goad. Now this is, by the way, verse 21 is one of those places where we learn the value of reading a modern translation or having a modern translation. In 1611, there was a huge number of Hebrew words that the people, the translators of the King James simply, They just didn't know what they meant. That was pretty simple. There were a lot of Hebrew words that they didn't know what it meant. So they looked at the context here and they said, gee, this thing that was for sharpening plow blades, mattocks, forks. So it must be a file. So older versions like the King James say, verse 21, that there was a file to sharpen, and there's no file in there. The Hebrew word pem, we've now found stone weights with the word pem on it. It's about 2/3 of a shekel. It's about a quarter ounce, a little more than a quarter ounce. And so this is what the Philistines were charging, that if you were a farmer and you wanted your plow blade or your axe sharpened, you had to go down and first of all, you had to take the day off or 2 days off to travel down to Philistine country. Then you had to pay a charge to get your your farm implement sharpened. And that's why in verse 22, so it came to pass in the day of battle that there was neither sword nor spear found in the hand of any of the people who were with Saul and Jonathan, but they were found with Saul and with Jonathan, his son. So somehow or other, the Israelites had figured out it was important to arm the leaders, the commanders, Saul and Jonathan. And so from someplace they had picked up weapons and armed Saul and Jonathan. And then verse 23, and the garrison of the Philistines went out to the pass of Michmash. And the pass of Michmash is just to the south of Michmash, and it's where Jonathan and his armor bearer are going to, in this next chapter, chapter 14, are going to attack the Philistines. So what you see here is a pretty good military move on the part of the Philistines, because they realize they've got some intelligence that Saul now has a small army of 600 men. And so they're going to take their body of army out of Michmash, and they're going to move it south closer to where Saul's little group is, and they're going to block that pass and make sure that that road can stay open so that the Philistines can pour down toward the south if they want to. And that's what's going on there in the geography. So chapter 14, verse 1, now it fell on a day. And the way the Hebrew works here is it's non-specific. It doesn't tell you what day, but it does let us know that it wasn't very long after Saul had gathered his men and the events of chapter 13 had occurred. So it fell on a day that Jonathan, the son of Saul, said to the young man who carried his armor, come and let us cross over to the Philistines' garrison that's on the other side. But he didn't tell his father. And here's the interesting situation. You've got father, son, you've got the king and his crown prince, his commanding officer. And Jonathan is a good man. He's a godly man. He walks by the Spirit. We know that Saul had been given Holy Spirit, but by his evil actions, he'd let demons in. So there was a pretty serious spiritual contest going on inside Saul. And at this particular point in his life, Saul wasn't making a whole lot of good, godly decisions. Jonathan knew that. I mean, Jonathan already figured that out. And so Jonathan at this point is walking by the Spirit. And what do? He's not going to go to his father and say, can I do this? Because his father's going to say no. So Jonathan is walking by the Spirit. And in this case, he end runs his father. And this, like I say, is an interesting, it doesn't give us the solution for how we handle our problems when there's somebody in authority over us who is ungodly, but it does point out one of the options. And sometimes we express this in business, in life, by saying it's easier to get forgiveness than permission. And that was certainly the case here. So it's an interesting walk by the Spirit. It happens in our lives occasionally. And so here's an incident of it happening in the Bible where the person above you is not a godly person, not walking in great wisdom. And if you're going to get anything done and help yourself and the people around you, and sometimes even your community or your country, you've got to pray and figure out how to move around the obstacle that is that person over you. In this case, Jonathan simply didn't tell his father. He just left. Verse 2, Saul was sitting under the pomegranate tree that was at the threshing floor on the outskirts of Gibeah. This would have been probably at a hotter time of the year, and so Saul is sitting in the shade. And the people who were with him were about 600 men. And Saul was sitting, basically a way of demonstrating his position as king, because kings got to sit while other people stood. And so he's got a little army there of about 600 men. Verse 3, and Ahijah was wearing an ephod. That tells you that Ahijah was taking the position of the high priest here. He was the son of Ahitub, Ichabod's brother, the son of Phinehas, the son of Eli, the priest of Yahweh at Shiloh. And if you remember when Samuel was first dedicated to the Lord and taken to the tabernacle, Eli was the high priest and he lived in Shiloh. Eli fell over and died, and the high priesthood juggled around a while. And now you have Ahijah, and he's the high priest, and he's wearing the ephod, and he is from the line of Eli. But he's, and the Bible doesn't describe exactly how this works. The temple wasn't built yet, but they were apparently carrying at least the ark, if not the full tabernacle. They were carrying the ark around with the army. And so verse 3 again, and Ahijah was wearing an ephod. He was the son of Ahitub, Ichabod's brother, the son of Phinehas, the son of Eli, the priest of Yahweh in Shiloh. And the people did not know that Jonathan was gone. Now this is another interesting mini lesson, that when people are pressured, when people are bullied, when people are frightened for their life and for their family, they turn inward and they think about themselves and they focus on themselves. Jonathan was the number 2 man in the entire group, and he disappears. He's not there. There's 600 people and not one of them is like, has anybody seen Jonathan lately? You know, because the people were frightened and they were self-focused. Verse 4, between the passes, and remember I talked about the passes and let's see, between the passes, and this is the passes that led up toward Michmash. I lost my place here on the computer. Wait a minute. Okay, there it is. Between the passes by which Jonathan sought to cross over to the Philistines' garrison, there was a tooth-shaped cliff on one side and a tooth-shaped cliff on the other side. And the name of the one was Bozez, which means shining, and the name of the other means the name of the other is Sinna, which means acacia. And to this day, the valley that leads out of there has a lot of acacia trees. So there's this very narrow, steep place that Jonathan has to ascend if he's going to get to the Philistine garrison. And verse 5, it said, the one tooth-shaped cliff rose up on the north in front of Michmash, the other on the south in front of Geba. So that shows you how the pass ran east to west. Verse 6. Oh, by the way, I should say, this description about these tooth-shaped rocks, by the time of Josephus, who lived after the time of Christ, he was probably contemporaneous with about the death of Christ, and then lived after the death of Christ and during the life of Paul and the Apostle John. But Josephus describes this exact path in some minute detail. So this exact place was really well known and described even as late as, say, the time of the Apostle John. So verse 6, and Jonathan said to the young man who carried his armor, come and let us cross over to the garrison of these uncircumcised. It may be that Yahweh will act on our behalf, for nothing can prevent Yahweh from delivering, whether by many or by few. And I believe Jonathan had already gotten revelation by this point, because otherwise attacking an entire garrison of the Philistines would be, it wouldn't be the wise thing to do. It wouldn't be the natural move to make. But I believe Jonathan had revelation at this point. And it's interesting, even with that he said, it may be that Yahweh will act on our behalf, because even when you got revelation in those times, it didn't necessarily guarantee that you would have like a complete or a total victory, or that you would be fine, that you would come out unscathed. And that's the same with us. There are times when God will give us an assignment, and it may be painful. It may cause repercussions. It may cause problems. And we know we're doing the will of God. And we see that all through the Bible, actually. But in Peter, I remember the verse that said, if you're persecuted for righteousness' sake, well, and Christ said that in the Sermon on the Mount too. And Peter said, if you suffer for doing what is right, and that sometimes happens, and we just have to be aware that that's the situation. So I believe Jonathan had the revelation to do what he did. But in his own mind, that didn't have a guarantee for him that he would be okay. By the way, there's a great example of this, so to speak, in Mark Twain's biography of Joan of Arc. By the way, if you do not know that Mark Twain wrote a biography of Joan of Arc that he spent years and years researching, and he testified that he considered it to be his greatest work, and that he considered Joan of Arc to be the most holy person to live since the time of Christ. And I think at 17 years old, God called her out and told her to fight for the French, and told her that she would be dead by age 21. And she absolutely obeyed God, and she started fighting it, I think age 17, and she was dead by the time she had finished her 21st year, if I remember correctly. She may have even been by the time she turned 21. But there was a time in battle when she had a personal female scribe, and she called her personal female scribe and told the scribe to write a letter to her parents and tell her parents that she would be okay from her wound in battle. And her personal scribe said, you don't really have a wound in battle. What do you mean? And Joan said, tomorrow I'm going to be shot right through the area of the collarbone. I'm going to be shot with an arrow. And the scribe lady flipped out and said, you can't go to war tomorrow. How can you go to war tomorrow knowing you're going to be shot? And she said, what? I'm going to send men ahead of me to their death in this battle. And because I know I'm going to be shot, I'm not going to go. How can I do that? How can I live like that? So she went to the battle. Sure enough, she was shot with an arrow through the collarbone. The collarbone area took her a long time to heal. So here's a lady that she knew she was doing the right thing. She knew she was doing the will of God, and it cost her. And that can be the same thing with us. It can cost us. And so we see that reflected here in what Jonathan says to his armor bearer, that it may be that Yahweh will act on our behalf, for nothing can prevent Yahweh from delivering, whether by many or by few. And that's where you and I have to keep in mind what the Lord told us by prophecies about a great future coming, a glorious future that's coming. If we focus on the personal sacrifice and the problems that taking a stand for God causes, then we will tend to pull back. But if we really understand, no, we're committed here. We're in it. We take up our cross and we follow him. We've got to be bold and got to speak up right now, that the adversary is bold in speaking up, and we need to as well. And I love, this armor bearer, this guy is unnamed. This guy, he's probably going to have a name tag in the kingdom that says Jonathan's armor bearer, just so we know who he is. I mean, what an amazing dude. here's Jonathan, who's the guy with the sword. He's probably got a club or a stick with a point on it. And Jonathan says, hey, let's go attack this Philistine outpost, the two of them. And the armor bearer said, you know what? I'm with you. Let's go get them. I can't, you can't buy heart like that. Wow. Amazing. Verse 7, his armor bearer said to him, do all that your heart inclines to do. Behold, I am with you according to your heart. Verse 8, then Jonathan said, behold, and listen to this, because see, Jonathan couldn't have just thought this up. This has to be God giving him revelation and really what I think you really ought to see in this is the calm, peaceful position of Jonathan's heart. That when he knew the will of God, he was calm and he was peaceful about it, even though he knew it might cost him. It was, in Greg's prophecy this morning, walk with great confidence. And there's a quiet confidence in what Jonathan says here. In verse 8, he says, behold, we will cross over to the men and we will reveal ourselves to them. And if they say to us, wait until we come to you, then we will stand still in our place and we will not go up to them. But if they say this, in verse 10, come up to us, then we will go up, for Yahweh has given them into our hand. This will be the sign to us. And, you can just, Yahweh has given them into our hand. They didn't know exactly what would happen. Both Jonathan and his armor bearer were seasoned fighters, skilled fighters. They could take on a man or two, no problem. They're facing an entire garrison. And they're like, okay, I don't know exactly how this is going to come down. When Samson picked up the jawbone of an ass, he probably didn't know that there were going to be 1,000 guys he was going to have to kill with it. But that's what he had to do. And so here's, and a lot of times we'll even say to ourselves, you go through something that's challenging, that's trying, that tests us, that wears us down a little bit. And you say, oh man, I'm glad God didn't tell me what that was going to take. He just told me to get started. And that's the situation here with Jonathan. He's just going to get started. Verse 11. So the two of them revealed themselves to the garrison of the Philistines. And the Philistines, who were massively overconfident, really, the Philistines said, look, the Hebrews are coming out of the holes where they have hidden themselves, which was actually mostly true. Verse 12. And the men of the garrison called out to Jonathan and his armor bearer and said, come up to us and we will show you something, basically meaning, come up to us and we'll have a fight and we'll show you how good we really are. And they relied on their strength of numbers. They relied on their superior weaponry. Jonathan said to his armor bearer, come up after me, for Yahweh has given them into the hand of Israel. And I love that confidence that he could speak like this. And he didn't say to the armor bearer, you go ahead, you go first. He said, you follow after me. Yahweh has given them into our hand. And that is how we've got to feel. It may take the battle of Armageddon for us, for us to see the kind of victory we'd love to see on earth. It may take the battle of Armageddon and Christ coming down, conquering the earth, but it will happen and Christ will win and we will be part of that army. When the army of God comes down from heaven following Jesus Christ, Revelation chapter 19, we will be part of that army. We will see a great victory. We might get to share in great victories now. We have to pray to God for the opportunities and have the boldness to step into them. And I love the confidence here, just this quiet confidence. Come up after me, for Yahweh has given them into the hand of Israel. Verse 13, so Jonathan climbed up on his hands and on his feet. That's how steep the bank was. And his armor bearer climbed after him. And they fell before Jonathan, and his armor bearer killed after him. And it's interesting that the word fell is sometimes used of fell dead, and sometimes it's just used of like fell down. Now, as Jonathan comes up over the cliff and as he attacks these first guys, I mean, these Philistines, they're seasoned fighters too. They've been conquering Israel for several years now. So these guys are seasoned fighters. Now they may have been surprised. I'm sure they were expecting Jonathan to kind of come up over the edge of the cliff and look around and see all the numbers and see the fancy weapons and kind of hold back. And instead, Jonathan comes up over that edge like a tiger, and he went right at him, and it threw him off. And I'm sure he killed a lot of people, but as they rallied, like I say, they were seasoned fighters, they're going to come at him. And some of them he's going to be able to kill with a stroke, and some of them he's just going to wound. So it says they fell before Jonathan, but his armor bearer, anybody that was kind of, laying there half wounded or stabbed or whatever on the battlefield, the armor bearer came up, and, after he killed one or two, you can bet he picked up a good spear or a good sword. And then they were a pretty well-armed team and going after that group of men as hard as they could. And that's another one of the great mini lessons here, is that God can give you revelation to do something. That doesn't mean it's a walk in the park, a piece of cake. It can still involve risk. It can still be very difficult. It still involves great trust and great focus and great determination. When we read the book of Judges, when the Israelites originally went to conquer the land, like of the Jezreel Valley and stuff, it says that the native inhabitants there had chariots, and they were determined to live there. And they were so determined to live there that they beat the Israelite army, who decided it was better at the time in the short run. It later bit them in the tail, but was better in the short run just to not try to take that territory, because the pagans were determined to live there. And you and I have to be determined to do the will of God. And we need to be determined to walk into the fight and get involved and get our hands dirty and take a risk, like Jonathan did here. And the battle, does that mean and we're going to come out unscathed? No, we don't know that we will. We might. It turned out Jonathan, his armor bearer, came out totally unscathed, weren't even wounded, but not guaranteed. So they fell before Jonathan, his armor bearer, killed after him. That first slaughter that Jonathan and his armor bearer made was about 20 men inside, as it were, half a furrow's length in an acre of land, about what you and I would call half an acre, or maybe a normal backyard. That in that space they killed 20 guys, which is pretty amazing. 2 people take on 20. And then God kicked in, because verse 15, and there was a trembling in the camp. All through the garrison there was a trembling. The word is also used for panic. So there was a panic or a trembling in the camp. And you see this all over the Philistine army, and in the field, and among all the people, the garrison and the raiders. They also panicked. They also trembled. And the earth quaked. It was a trembling from God. Now, there are some versions that'll say it was a great trembling or a very great trembling. And sometimes the word God is used to express a superlative position. A famine of God might be a great famine, that kind of thing. Some of the translations go that way, that there was a very great trembling. But I think the versions and the commentaries that go with this trembling was from God are more accurate in this situation. Because once Jonathan and his armor bearer were really moving, walking by the Spirit, determined to obey God, determined to do the will of God, determined to help Israel regain their land, then the Spirit of God kicked in a way that it had not done before, and the whole Philistine army panics. Verse 16, and the watchman of Saul in Gibeah of Benjamin, and Gibeah is on a high point, very high point in Israel. And the watchman of Saul in Gibeah looked, and behold, the multitude, all the Philistines, they melted away. And they didn't go away in close marching order. They went here and there. The Hebrew text indicates, they just kind of ran wherever in the world they could. Verse 17, and Saul said to the people, and Saul had at least enough sense to know, well, something's changed. The Philistines are running away. So Saul said to the people who were with him, count now and see who's missing from us. And when they had counted, behold, Jonathan and his armor bearer were not there. Then Saul said to Ahijah, bring the ark of God here. for the ark of God was with the children of Israel at that time. So they were carrying it around so they could, ask of God for things. Verse 19, but it came to pass that as Saul was speaking to the priest, that the uproar that was in the camp of the Philistines went on and increased. So the shouting and of course, then they were close enough that then they could hear what was going on. And they basically, Saul kind of woke up mentally and realized, I have an opportunity here to take advantage of this and kill some of the Philistines. And so he says, he said to the priest, withdraw your hand, meaning take your hand out of your breastplate. I'm not going to ask of God right now by the Urim and Thummim, what we should do. I know what to do. Verse 20, and Saul and all the people who were with him assembled themselves and went to the battle. And when they got there, look how God had moved among the enemy. Behold, every man's sword was against his fellow, and there was very great confusion. The Philistines were killing each other off. Saul and his army showed up at the battle site, the garrison where the main army of the Philistines were, and there was confusion in the camp, and the Philistines were so blind and so panicked, they were killing each other. You and I can pray for that. I pray for confusion in the enemy's camp all the time. If the enemy is confused, if the enemy's people are confused, God can get a lot more work done. And this is something that we can pray for. It's something to be aware of. Verse 21, now the Hebrews that had been with the Philistines before that time, because the Philistines had conquered a large swath of Israel, and some of the Israelites had just seen it better. I'm just going to go join up with the Philistines and, be part of their camp. And so it says that the Philistines, where to get off to? Oh, verse 21, the Hebrews that had been with the Philistines before that time, who went up with them into the camp from all around, they too turned to be with the Israelites who were with Saul and Jonathan. So now the Israelites' forces are expanded by the addition of these Israelites that had previously been with the Philistines. And then verse 22, likewise, when all the men of Israel who'd hidden themselves in the hill country of Ephraim, you remember what the Philistines said, the Israelites are coming out of the holes. And here it is, the men of Israel who had hidden themselves in the hill country of Ephraim heard that the Philistines fled. They also pursued them in battle. So Yahweh saved Israel that day. And then I want to just read a couple more verses here. Says the battle went out beyond Bethaven. Bethaven is actually to the east of Michmash. Most of the Philistines were trying to run home to the coast, to the west, but it shows the state of confusion here that some of them were even running east. Verse 24, but the men of Israel were distressed that day, for Saul had put the people under an oath curse, saying, cursed be the man who eats any food until it's evening, and I have avenged myself of my enemies. So none of the people tasted food. And this was a really, really stupid decision. And it kept Israel, if you keep reading on the record, it kept Israel from getting a complete victory because the people were too tired to fight, too hot, too tired, worn out, and they were too tired to fight. And this is more of the bad fruit in Saul's life, and more of where the contest in him between the Spirit of God and the demons that he had by this time, that contest was being won by the demons. And so at a time when he needed his army to fight, he had an opportunity to kill the Philistines, he had an opportunity to take back land for Israel. Instead, he commands his people that they can't eat food. And it looks so pious. And this is something you and I need to watch for. Occasionally, you're around somebody and they just seem so pious and so holy, in what they propose, and yet it bears such bad fruit. And a godly person can see it from a mile away that it's going to bear bad fruit. And we've got to call a spade a spade. Unfortunately, Saul was the king. He did make the oath curse. The people were sworn to it, and Israel really suffered. because of that day. And this, this isn't just ancient history. We have leaders today that are making terrible decisions, and America is suffering because of it. And we need to pray that those demons are back down, that there's confusion in among those demons and among the demonic people, and that God's people take a stand for what's right. So this is what I wanted to share this morning, because I really believe, like I said when I opened up, there are going to be opportunities for us to really be bold and take a stand in these days, because the enemy is being incredibly bold and good men are being incredibly stupid about what to do. And we need to take a stand and speak into the situation and see if we can help our country, our countries, and help out God's people who are being victimized by stupid decisions being made by leaders. And also, like in Greg Paulus's prophecy, there are hungry people out there. There really are. But how can they believe if no one preaches? We've got to get out and teach loud and long and see if we can turn people from darkness to light and add people to our family. Thank you for being with us this morning, and the floor is wide open for discussion, comments, wherever you guys want to go. And I so appreciate your being here.